I guess like the kind of, again, sort of standard public story that gets told about him is him tattooing people like Janis Joplin in particular. So that often gets sort of held up as a really kind of interesting pivotal moment. And then he was in Rolling Stone magazine, right, in like 71 or there or thereabouts. And I mean, he's I guess may have the claim of at least kind of one of, or if not the first kind of celebrity tattoo artist of that era, right?
So with regards to his relationship, to Janis Joplin, at the time, we'll say between 1960 and 1989, Lyle had his uber super famous 7th Street shop, right, in San Francisco. And, because he looked the part, he was just being himself. He wasn't looking to get likes or follows on an Instagram page. Lyle was being himself. Lyle was a Renaissance man. Lyle was a super creative person. He was a very social person. And, Janis Joplin then came into his life through actually, the Rolling Stone article. He knew somebody that basically wrote for Rolling Stone magazine. And then I'm trying to think of the other details of that. He was photographed by Annie Leibovitz, I guess in 1972, just after that. But, with regards to the Janis Joplin thing, she met him at some party or something. And there's a very famous...
Again, old San Francisco,
yeah. Yeah. And, she at the time this was probably in the last year or so of her life, she did a super famous that you can find online. It's an interview with Dick Cavett. And she talks about Lyle and getting tattooed by Lyle and meeting him and all these stars and God, you should see him and he's just gorgeous. And so, she went in and got 2 tattoos by Lyle. And, the Rolling Stone thing, that sort of came, again, this was just a destined thing. I believe the writer of that article was Amy Hill. And she's still living up in Northern California somewhere. We actually tracked her down, Lyle and I, about 2 years before he passed, just to kind of, yeah. And that was sort of where that was sort of the wave of the media, right? And, Rolling Stone at the time, I mean, he was like a rock star, to be on the cover. And, he knew all these super famous musicians, Freddie King, Albert King, the Allman Brothers, and then soon after the early 70s, we'll say 71, 72, then he had the kind of success that he, brought him down to have a shop in Hollywood. And so then again, more kind of this Hollywood vibe, always rooted in San Francisco and, just being a country boy in Northern California. But yeah, it was very unheard of, I think, at the time for somebody to, that was certainly in the tattooing practice, to be out there kind of sharing themselves. But, he was happy to have the admiration and the attention and the accolades. But he was still very much a working tattoo artist,
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to say again, because obviously I only have this, as I said to you again over messaging, I was, he was meant to be coming to England the week after he ended up sadly passing away, because he'd been for decades in contact with and had a quite intimate collection with tattooing in the UK. And it's really clear that as famous as he was and as kind of, photogenic and as kind of glamorous as his, public persona was, he was a tattoo guy. He cared about tattooing in a very genuine way. I want to move on in a second to talk about tattoo history, because clearly, he had a real deep, abiding love for the history of the craft as much as its present and future. And yeah, it's interesting that you say that about being a working tattooer, because that is, again, the kind of things that I've heard from people that knew him over the years, and seeing where he pops up in the historical record of people that he knew and worked with. It's really clear that, as he could have probably sat in his shop in Hollywood and tattooed all day, every day, and never had to move a mile. But he was clearly interested in meeting other tattoo artists, in corresponding and collecting and learning, and that kind of attitude to life I find very inspiring. And it's not something that I think, interestingly, it's in a lot of tattooers. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. So a lot of tattooers who make it to that age and still, even if they're not still working, care about tattooing. People that are still around the tattoo industry in their, 60s, 70s, 80s, have all of them that I know at least have that attitude of like excitement and interest, and they have their kind of grumpy moments and their kind of cynical days, but underneath it all there's this real genuine love for tattooing, and not just tattooing's kind of place in the world. And from hearing you talk about Lyle, Daniel, that seems to be something that came across from him even in those later years of his life when he wasn't tattooing every day.
Yeah, I mean, he had basically professionally so stopped tattooing probably by around like 1992. But, and that was sort of like, the years in which tattooing was just, kind of moving forward and becoming so much more of a popularized, practice. And it was that much more socially acceptable, certainly by the 90s. And then, you have like the convention circuits are starting. But Lyle, even, through the 70s and 80s, he had his artistic fulfillment in a lot of different areas, being, a top tattoo machine builder, being a metalsmith. He was super handy. I mean, he would just build things. Like a year before he died, he was out in the backyard, like carving a stump out of the ground. And it was like 96 degrees out there. I mean, he had this type of like, I'll do it myself mentality. I'll go there myself. He traveled back to Burt Grimm just for a minute. He traveled to Alaska, and he was basically the first traveling tattoo artist in Alaska in 1957. Before it was even a state, he was up in Alaska. And, he was the definition of maverick. And he also loved really, and he had a lot to do with, modernizing tattooing practices as far as sterilization. And, he taught a lot of tattoo artists in seminars that he would hold, and that was how a lot of people that weren't tattoo artists actually came into tattooing, even, as a sort of later in life career. I know a lot of characters that were like in their 30s, met Lyle, were interested in tattooing, and he just like turned them on to becoming tattoo machine builders and then tattoo artists. And, even at the very end there, that was really a couple of heartbreaking weeks. I mean, finding out, how sick Lyle was and having to cancel that trip to go to England because, personally speaking, Lyle introduced me in being so close with him and traveling with him. He introduced me to so many amazing characters. And, we were both really disappointed that we're obviously not going to be able to make that trip because he was in hospice care. It was a miracle to even get him home, to pass in his childhood home. Yeah.
And I did speak to some people, in the years before that were happening, who were like, they'd met Lyle at a convention, and he was still, occasionally tattooing his signature on people, fairly shakily handed by that point. But people were like, I can't believe that guy's still alive.
I know.
Like he was by all accounts this kind. And my friend and collaborator, occasionally Anna Freeman, and him went to Antarctica together, where he was the first tattooer to tattoo on every continent, including Antarctica. They tattooed in a Russian
he was so proud to say that there. And do that trip with her. And I mean, he was already at the time, I guess he was like 81 or 82 years old, something like that.
But everyone was like, as you said earlier on, like he was still chatting away, and like this life of the party, center of attention, loud, opinionated, fun, irascible. Like that was the kind of storytelling about that I heard from him about him, even in that, those days when clearly he was getting older and more frail.
It was funny you asked me earlier, oh well, were you tattooed? I don't know how I made it through. I'm born in 71 and I can remember my sister getting her first tattoo, and I was curious about it, but I always had a sort of fear factor about it too. Not that it was going to hurt, but I just thought, oh gosh, like what is going to be a tattoo that's going to mean so much to me? And, it's coming now to me to share that Lyle gave me my first tattoo. And it's just a tiny little Libra sign. You can probably barely even see it there.
Great.
We were both Libras, and that seemed to be like, just a good kind of, I didn't know how I felt about having his signature, although so many people were so psyched to have his signature.
Yeah.
So I have two.
I think it's pretty different if you're like seeing him every day and living, like working closely with him to have his signature on than if you're just
it was funny,
collector.
I was with my mom, and my mom got her first tattoo, and I got my first tattoo. Not hers wasn't by Lyle. But I sat there with Lyle and I thought, God, I mean, if I was working with a painter, and the painter wanted to paint me, or if I could have that kind of experience, like this is Lyle's practice. I didn't get the tattoo so much because it was going to be, I have a tattoo by the great Lyle Tuttle. It was just that I spent every day with Lyle for, quite a lot of years there. And, I thought, God, what's the matter with me? I'm not a virgin. I have my ears pierced. Life changes, your body changes. Get the damn tattoo. And
the first one's always the hardest one, Danielle.
Well, you know what it was too. It was such a beautiful day, and he tattooed me. My mom had her mermaid tattoo on her leg, and the three of us, he took us over to this beautiful historical place, which he loved to visit, called the Cliff House, which was on the ocean in San Francisco, and we talked about the history there of the Sutro baths, and God, he could tell you everything about everything, but especially San Francisco history. And God, it was a super memorable day. And then I have another tattoo he did when I did the 70th retrospective for him. And so I wear them very proudly. And I'll also tell you that, he gave me my first tattoo and I gave him his last. And that's
wow.
not anything that a lot of people know, but it's sort of, it was really full circle thing for us.